In late October 1929, the world didn't just watch markets fall, it watched confidence itself collapse. Billions of dollars in paper wealth disappeared in a matter of days, triggering panic from Wall Street to Westminster. But why? Why did a few bad days on the stock market spiral into one of the greatest economic catastrophes in human history? And more curiously, where did all that money actually go? People talk about the Great Depression as if it began with a sudden bang, but it really began with belief. For nearly a decade, the 1920s roared with prosperity, jazz, and endless optimism. Factories hummed, radios sold by the millions, and Americans believed they'd unlocked a permanent era of wealth. But why did everyone think the party would never end? Because human psychology is wired for momentum. When prices rise, so does confidence. And when confidence rises, so do prices. It was a feedback loop of euphoria disguised as progress. Yet beneath the champagne bubbles of the roaring 20s, the foundations were cracking. Companies were being valued not on their actual profits, but on their future promise. Investors weren't just buying stocks, they were buying dreams, often with borrowed money. So why did so many intelligent people ignore the risks? Because speculation doesn't feel like gambling when everyone around you is winning. And when banks offered easy credit to buy even more stocks, the system became an echo chamber of borrowed optimism. By late 1929, the illusion began to break. Farmers couldn't sell their crops, factories couldn't sell their goods, and debt began to whisper what optimism had drowned out. You owe more than you own. Then came October 24th, Black Thursday. $5 billion of value evaporated in a single day. But why did the panic spread so fast? Because markets are not ruled by numbers, they're ruled by emotion. Bankers stepped in, trying to calm the chaos and promising stability. But promises are fragile in the face of a freefall. Within days, Black Monday and Black Tuesday followed. But again, where did all that money go? The truth is, most of it never existed in a physical sense. It wasn't cash sitting in vaults. It was perceived value, born from collective belief. When that belief collapses, the value collapses with it. Think of it like a house's value. It's worth $1 million one day. But if nobody's willing to pay that anymore, its value can drop to $500,000 overnight. The $500,000 didn't go anywhere. It just ceased to exist. But that doesn't mean no real money was lost. When banks fell, deposits vanished. When loans defaulted, assets died. The circulation of wealth didn't just stop, it reversed. So what really disappeared in 1929 wasn't just money, it was trust. Belief alone wasn't the only thing that collapsed. Ever wondered where billions of dollars vanished during the 1929 stock market crash? To find the answer, we have to go back in time to the Roaring '20s. This era wasn't just about jazz and flapper dresses. It was an age of unshakable faith and progress. Technology was advancing, cities were booming, and the stock market became the new national pastime. Everyone, from factory workers to titans of industry, was convinced the only way was up. But they forgot to ask one crucial question. What happens if it goes down? The entire system was built on a very risky foundation, margin trading. This meant people were buying stocks with borrowed money. It was a brilliant strategy as long as stock prices kept climbing. But the moment they started to fall, that same leverage tightened like a noose. Debts still had to be paid, even as investments turned to dust. A few defaults quickly spiraled, creating a chain reaction that ripped through the entire financial system. And it wasn't just individual investors who were caught in this web. Banks, from Wall Street giants to small-town lenders, were just as reckless. They weren't just lending money to speculators, they were speculating themselves, loading their books with overvalued stocks and questionable loans. Why take such enormous risks? Because in the frenzy of the 20s, caution was seen as cowardice, and risk-taking was celebrated as genius. Official reports from the time show a disturbing trend. Deposits were soaring, but lending practices were becoming increasingly irresponsible. It was a house of cards, beautiful and grand, but held together only by collective delusion. The collapse was not a matter of if, but when. So, when the market finally did buckle, it took everyone down with it. Margin calls forced massives, which led to defaults, which in turn triggered a catastrophic wave of bank failures. Between 1930 and 1933, thousands of banks disappeared, taking the life savings of millions of ordinary people with them. The economy couldn't just bounce back, because credit, the very lifeblood of a modern economy, had frozen solid. Businesses couldn't borrow to expand, factories couldn't get loans to operate, and consumers couldn't spend. Industrial production plummeted, unemployment skyrocketed, and a market crash morphed into the Great Depression. But where were the guardians of this system? The bankers, the regulators, the government. Some did try to intervene, attempting to prop up prices and restore order, but their efforts failed spectacularly. Their motivation wasn't to stabilize the system for everyone, it was to save themselves. The major financial institutions were deeply involved in the same risky games they were supposed to be policing, and government oversight. It was almost non-existent. Banking regulations were shockingly primitive by today's standards, with no real rules. Greed was rebranded as innovation, and wild speculation was called strategy. The crash didn't just expose economic flaws, it revealed a deep moral fragility. So, where did all that money really go? The truth is unsettling. A large part of it simply evaporated as stock valuations collapsed. It was wealth that only ever existed on paper. Another chunk was locked away in failed banks, gone forever. More was lost to bad debts that would never be repaid. But the most significant loss wasn't financial. What was truly lost was trust, the invisible currency that underpins our entire economic world. When trust shatters, even sound money becomes worthless paper. The 1929 crash taught us a painful lesson. Confidence is fragile, and once broken, it can take generations to rebuild. When the dust of 1929 settled, all eyes turned to the institutions meant to protect us. The government, the Federal Reserve, the regulators. Where were they? Records show a flurry of activity. Emergency rate cuts, public reassurances, but none of it stopped the bleeding. Why? Because these actions were driven by dogma, not data. They believed markets would just fix themselves. The Federal Reserve, clinging to a sound money philosophy, hesitated. They withheld liquidity when it was needed most. Banks failed, credit froze, and the one thing holding it all together, confidence, vanished. So, where did all the money go? Those missing billions? It wasn't stolen in the night. It simply dissolved. Stocks worth hundreds became worth pennies. Money wasn't taken, its value was redefined. This matters because it shows that financial crashes aren't about losing paper, they're about the death of promises. But this wasn't just an economic event, it was a social reckoning. When the banks failed, families failed with them. Decades of savings disappeared overnight. Why did ordinary people bear the brunt of a crisis they didn't create? Because in every collapse, risk flows downward, while responsibility floats upward. Soup kitchens replaced department stores. Factories became graveyards of ambition. The photographs from that era don't show numbers. They show faces: the unemployed, the homeless, the forgotten. And the shockwaves didn't stop at the shore. European economies, still fragile from World War I, relied on American credit. When that lifeline was cut, their currencies collapsed, banks failed, and unemployment soared. Why did a Wall Street problem become a world crisis? It's because global finance, even then, was an invisible empire. When its capital flows froze, entire nations suffocated. In the years that followed, governments scrambled for answers. Congress held hearings, hunting for the missing billions. What they found wasn't just negligence, it was systemic blindness. Unchecked speculation, reckless banking, and a total lack of consumer protection had created an economy addicted to its own illusion. This led to landmark reforms like the Glass-Steagall Act and the creation of the SEC to police the markets. But why did it take a total collapse to inspire regulation? Because prosperity blinds us. When profits are soaring, no one wants to fix a machine that seems to be working, even if it's on fire inside. But even with these reforms, the full story remained elusive. Records vanished, some destroyed, some conveniently lost. Private bank ledgers and untraceable transactions concealed the real movement of capital. The official version of the story we got was a sanitized one, a partial truth. What we're left with is a puzzle. On paper, the 1929 crash was an over-leveraged economy, collapsing under its own weight. But the trail of the missing billions feels incomplete. Why? Because beneath the visible system of banks and markets lay a shadow. Economy 1, built on hidden deals and informal networks that eluded any oversight. In this gray zone between loss and theft, some money truly disappeared, while some merely changed hands, unseen. Here's where the story gets darker. Even the official records began to contradict themselves. The very institutions documenting the collapse were also implicated in it. Banks, trusts, and brokerage firms were so tangled that no one could trace who owed what to whom. In that fog, manipulation thrived. Speculators revalued assets on paper to maintain credit. Losses were hidden behind creative bookkeeping. By the time regulators looked, the damage was done. During the congressional hearings of the 1930s, insiders started talking. Whistleblowers described inflated balance sheets and depositor money secretly used to prop up failing banks. But why didn't the public hear everything? Because not every truth survives the institutions it threatens. Many documents were sealed. Others were quietly destroyed. Rumors persisted of financiers who shorted the market, betting on its collapse while everyone else clung to hope. They weren't just lucky. They had information the public never saw. What if their trades didn't just profit from the crash? What if they helped cause it? The 1929 collapse, then, wasn't just an accident of economics. It was a mirror reflecting human nature, greed, denial, and the fragile belief that systems built by men can never truly fail. Certain banks behaved in ways that just didn't add up. Some suddenly shut their doors, claiming they were insolvent. Yet records later hinted that their assets had been quietly moved elsewhere. sometimes overseas, just days before they closed. When destruction is on the horizon, the powerful don't panic, they prepare. Think about it. Affiliated firms abroad suddenly received massive inflows of capital. Was this just incredible foresight, or was it something more coordinated? Historians still debate whether these were just protective maneuvers or covert escapes, attempts to preserve elite wealth before the public realized the entire system was crumbling. Either way, the result was the same. When the dust settled, ordinary depositors were left with absolutely nothing, while certain powerful interests emerged mysteriously intact. But the destruction didn't stop there. The collapse of the credit system created a second, invisible wave of devastation. Businesses, suddenly unable to pay back their loans, defaulted, debts multiplied, creating a domino effect. But why was tracing these obligations nearly impossible? Because the financial instruments themselves, the bonds, the securities, were often backed by illusions. The collateral that was supposed to guarantee them either does and exist or had lost all its value overnight. So, many investors lost not just their own money, but also the money they had lent to others. This multiplied the disappearance of wealth through layer after layer of broken promises. The missing billions weren't just missing from bank accounts, they were missing from accountability itself. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Chaos doesn't just destroy, it also creates opportunity. As the legitimate economy crumbled, a shadow economy quietly began to flourish. Black market exchanges, underground currency trades, and secret backroom deals started pulsing beneath the surface of all that desperation. And why does this matter? Because every financial void attracts those who are willing and ready to exploit it. Currency moved through unofficial channels, assets were traded in total secrecy, and new fortunes were rebuilt from the ashes, unseen by regulators and unrecorded by historians. This wasn't just a financial collapse anymore. It was the evolution of economic survivalism. While the public suffered, another battle was unfolding, a political one. Investigations later revealed intense lobbying efforts by powerful banking interests. Their goal: to block stricter reforms and delay any laws that would bring transparency to the system. Now, why would you fight oversight in the middle of a total collapse? Because regulation threatens control. For those who had already secured their wealth, exposing the system's fragility would serve no purpose except perhaps to reveal just how much they had known long before everyone else. This political resistance, cloaked in arguments about free markets and economic freedom, only deepened public suspicion. And it was from those suspicions that conspiracy theories were born, not from wild imagination, but from very real, unanswered questions. And then came the whispers that refused to die down, even after decades. How did certain financiers, who were seemingly exposed to the exact same risks as everyone else, emerge from the crash even richer than they were before? Why did a handful of powerful figures manage to sell short just before the collapse, timing it with surgical precision? To be clear, no definitive proof has ever surfaced that the crash was deliberately orchestrated. Yet, these patterns of survival raise some deeply uncomfortable possibilities. Some historians argue that a small circle of insiders exploited the market's volatility, amplifying the panic to profit directly from it. Others dismiss this as mere coincidence, the cruel symmetry of luck and leverage. So why does this suspicion persist after nearly a century? Because wealth rarely just disappears, it merely changes hands. And when a crisis of this magnitude redistributes billions of dollars, the line between brilliant strategy and outright manipulation becomes dangerously thin. Ultimately, the missing billions of 1929 weren't a single event. They were a symphony of failures, shattered market valuations, fraudulent reporting, political inertia, and human greed, all playing in perfect, destructive harmony. Even today, economists argue not over the numbers, but over the shadows. What was lost? What was hidden? When the stock market collapsed in 1929, it wasn't just numbers that fell to it, was faith. America's economy, once roaring with optimism, suddenly froze. Factories went silent, banks shut their doors, millions lost their jobs seemingly overnight. But why did this feel less like a financial dip and more like a social apocalypse? Because when people's money vanished, so did their sense of security. The real loss wasn't just wealth. It was the illusion that progress was permanent. Suddenly, entire industries began to cannibalize themselves. Companies laid off workers to save money, but that just meant fewer people could afford their products. Why didn't anyone see this vicious cycle forming? Because in a world built on credit and confidence, everyone assumed tomorrow would be just like yesterday until it wasn't. Families watched their life savings evaporate. Homes were repossessed. Communities that once thrived on ambition now survived on soup kitchens and silent shame. But the real tragedy? The crash didn't just destroy wealth. It dismantled trust, a invisible glue holding the entire economic system together. In the chaos that followed, governments scrambled, yet the first response wasn't bold leadership, it was denial. Policymakers clung to outdated beliefs that the markets would simply sit and correct, But why cling to old ideas when reality is screaming otherwise? Because ideology often outlasts reason, especially when the powerful fear losing their grip. Early interventions were timid, too little and too late. Banks were failing faster than relief could arrive. It wasn't until Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal that the tide finally began to shift. Massive public works projects, financial reforms, and social safety nets restored not just jobs, but a sense of direction. But was the New Deal merely a rescue, or was it a quiet revolution? For the first time, the government wasn't just a referee. It became an economic architect. The creation of the SEC, the Glass-Steagall Act, and deposit insurance wasn't just reformat, was a fundamental rewriting of capitalism's rulebook. Even today, scholars still debate, why did it all collapse? Some blame structural flaws over production, rampant inequality, and reckless speculation. Others point to human psychology, euphoria, greed, and denial. But beneath all the theories lies something deeper: vulnerability. The world in 1929 was already deeply interconnected through trade, loans, and currency systems. When America sneezed, the entire world caught pneumonia. So why didn't global leaders act together? Because nationalism and protectionism clouded their judgment. Each country fought to save itself, even if it meant sinking everyone else in the process. The crash revealed a stark truth: no economy truly stands alone. Every nation's wealth was built on another's promise, and when one of those promises broke, they all began to unravel. And yet, decades later, one question refuses to die: where did the missing billions really go? Whispers persist of secret transfers, offshore accounts, and covert fortunes preserved while the public burned. Can we ever prove it? Perhaps not. The deeper you dig, the murkier the records become. Documents vanished. Archives were sealed. The trail fades into a fog of speculation and silence. But why does this mystery endure? Because it challenges a comforting myth that the system is fair, that when a collapse comes, it hits everyone equally. History tells us otherwise. Some fell, others floated on. The difference wasn't luck, it was knowledge. But here lies the final irony. Nearly a century later, the archives of many major banks remain sealed. Certain transaction records, trust documents, and offshore ledgers are still restricted, inaccessible to researchers and the public alike. Why? Because transparency threatens the myth. Revealing the full picture might not just explain history, it might expose uncomfortable truths about how wealth and power operate even today. And so, the 1929 crash continues to fascinate us, not just as an economic event, but as a psychological mirror. It forces us to confront unsettling questions. Why do the same few always seem to emerge unscathed? Why do collapses hide their architects behind layers of complexity? And why do we keep believing that markets are moral when history repeatedly proves they are merely mathematical? Perhaps the real mystery of the missing billions isn't about where the money went, but about who learned to control the art of disappearance itself. The lessons of 1929 are not just about money. They're about memory, and how quickly societies forget the very lessons that pain once taught us. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history as fascinating as I did, do you want to forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world.